And what I intend to do, although the theme is the macroeconomics of agriculture, I really want to, this is almost something which comes out of the fact that there are a lot of questions in my head. And it's actually playing those questions out and offering possible answers as we go along. I mean, that's the structure of what I intend to do. It's therefore not a complete statement of this is the issue. And in order to do that, I want to actually begin with the present, then look at the past, which is where the macroeconomics really comes in, and then try to project something about the future. Now, why begin with the present? Now, the reason I want to begin with the present is that there is a general consensus that India is in an agrarian crisis. And this was expected, for example, to play itself out in the elections which had just happened and the state elections which had come before that. Now, clearly, in the national election, incumbency has won. So if it was a crisis, this is not a crisis which came out in terms of a strong anti-incumbency against the central government. And in fact, the data that we have suggests that even in the state elections, it didn't quite play it out in the way you would have thought. What do I mean by that? We had three very important states which went to the polls just before the general elections: Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And in all of them, the incumbent government lost. So that was different from and there was a general impression that this happened because of many reasons maybe, but the agrarian issue was claimed to be one. The surprise lies in the following, that when I look at the state value-added figures, Madhya Pradesh, during that 4 years leading up to the election, had a growth rate of 10% per annum in agriculture. Chhattisgarh had a growth rate of about 5.5% in agriculture. It's only Rajasthan which had a negative thing which fits the bill. But just as in the national case, the incumbency and the so-called agrarian crisis then doesn't quite fit the bill here either, at least in terms of the growth rates of agricultural output. Now, having made that statement, let me also add that maybe by agrarian crisis we don't mean GDP growth in agriculture. Maybe we mean something else. And that, I think, is the first question to flag. But since I have started with the GDP issue, let me just state what the current is. And by the current, I mean, say, the last 5 years. The NDA years, in some sense. And to draw a distinction between that and the past. And the recent past, let's take as the years I was in government, which was the UPA years, the whole 10 years of. Now, if you actually look at the GDP figures on agricultural growth, then the last 5 years gives us, the CSO gives us an average rate of growth of 2.9% per annum in agriculture. That's agriculture and allied. So it includes livestock, fisheries, as well as forestry, in addition to crops. Now 2.9 isn't too bad. It's not great, but 2.9 is roughly the long-term Indian average of agricultural growth. It's not pathetic. It's not the sort of thing you would talk about as a crisis if the crisis had completely to do with agriculture. However, there is some hint that there may be something wrong. If one breaks down this last 5 years agricultural growth into the very broad component and separates, the fisheries, which in any case can be separable, forestry, livestock, and looks at them separately. There, one finds that the rate of growth of crop agriculture is only 0.5%. Okay, the rest is made up of really that remaining 7% per annum, which gives 7 and 0.5 gives you that 2.9 average for all the sectors. That 7 is largely made up of 7% growth, both in fisheries and in livestock. Now, how does that compare, for example, with the 10 years of the UPA? Crops in the 10 years of the UPA were growing at about 3.2, 3.3, something like that. So that's quite a large difference between that and 0.5. And livestock was growing at around 5.5%, 6% per annum. Fisheries roughly the same thing. That seems to have gone up from the 5.5, 6 to about 7. Now that's the broad sort of numbers of the GDP growth. Then maybe when we're talking about crisis, we are talking about the crisis mainly to do with crops. That's what most people look at in agriculture, and we are ignoring, in some sense, the livestock sector, which may have done well. But that still leaves me a big question. And that question mark is that there have been various policy decisions and ideological background, and what's not just background, is the ideology of trying to stop cow slaughter, which has led, of course, to slaughter of human beings, and it has led to a huge increase in the number of stray cattle moving around. Now, and in addition, it has also meant that, and this we know for a fact, that sectors like leather, sectors which have any connection with dead cattle have done very poorly in this period. These were our export sectors. Leather was an export sector, beef was an export sector, and these have come crashing down. Now, in the face of that, actually the livestock sector doing well is in itself a bit of a surprise, but it need not be too much, because livestock is not simply the cattle sector, it's other things, and some of those sectors have done fairly well. For example, the poultry sector. And the poultry sector is usually so separate nowadays from the main farming sector in terms of at least the value add that largely comes from large poultry farms. So that might have nothing to do with our notion of it. But nonetheless, there is a nagging suspicion, which is that this growth that we are seeing in the livestock sector, is it real? And I say this without offering an answer, but pointing at certain. This is a period in which everybody is criticizing the GDP figures. We know that there are certain parts of the agricultural GDP which are relatively good. But we know that there are two large parts of our agricultural GDP figures which are not so good. One relates to horticulture, which is part of the crop sector, and the other is the livestock sector. Much of our livestock production statistics is linked to agricultural, to the livestock census. So it's to the number of animals, and then you make certain ratios and you assign a certain value to these things. And that can create all sorts of errors. And an interesting thing to look at is that when you actually start looking at what is it that grew, yes, it was, poultry was very fast growing. But funnily enough, it is in fact the cattle sector, which is the other big sector. And the large increase is not because of the obvious contribution of cattle sector to the GDP, and that's milk. Milk production keeps growing at about 5%. It is two other things. One is beef production, which is growing at something like 8.5%, and you have increment in livestock, which is growing at about 9%. Now, this increment in livestock is a rather funny creature, because it simply says that if there are more cattle, then the GDP grows. It doesn't really matter what that cattle is doing. And the beef production figures are often simply calculations by so much percentage has been used as meat sort of a thing. And therefore there might be something fishy about this. So, if you are unhappy about my first statement regarding growth, then you could say, okay, very low growth in crops and a set of livestock figures which, at least for the cattle component, may have certain errors. But by and large, it still remains the case that, taken all together, except for this huge divide between crops and livestock, the large figures are not very different from the past. Okay, the overall GDP figures. Now, before coming to the economics of all this, let me actually flag two other items. The first is purely law economics, and that is still quite important, because I think everybody recognizes it's important, and it's becoming very clear in India that climate and climate change is playing some role somewhere. It becomes very important because over the last 5 years, we have seen the frequency of extreme events increasing very rapidly, and these extreme events, like the Kerala floods, are going up in not just incidents, but in terms of the loss that they're causing as well. And clearly, extreme events can be something which contributes to crisis, at least in localized terms. So I think the first point to note in this case is that as far as temperature is concerned, there has been a slow increase in temperatures, however you look at it, but much more concentrated in the maximum temperatures than in the minimum temperatures, is a steady rise from sometime in the late 70s. The Met Department has figures on what they call temperature anomalies, which is basically at any point you have a series of temperature and you take the average for some years for that point and you calculate the anomalies for the years for which you have the data, and then you add up all the anomalies. Since the data is not necessarily complete, the anomalies are the ones being added up rather than the base itself. Now, currently the base that the Met Department uses is an average from 1970 to 2010. Now, if you take the period before the 1980s, there is very little fluctuation in the anomalies. It's roughly a straight line. There's fluctuation, but if you take a 4-year, 5-year average, it's pretty flat. And that flat point is itself about half a degree less than the 70-2010 average. Okay, so the 70-2010 average was half a degree higher than whatever was the norm before 1980. And today, it's about a half a degree higher than the 70-80 degree. More. So that in the course of about 40 years, we've warmed by about a degree. And that's no joke. And this is something which has continued to affect us irrespective of government. Okay, I mean, no government has anything to do with this. I can't do anything. The hottest year so far, and it's probably going to be this year, but the hottest year other than this year was 2016. And before that was 2009. Before that it was 2015. Before that it was 2010. Now, like this, you have 11 of the 15 hottest years since 1901. Okay, if you take the 15 hottest years since 1901, 11 of them are in the last 15 years. Okay, so there is no doubt that there is a warming going on, and what we know about projections based for the purposes of the IPCC is that in the long term, another 2 degrees change would actually mean that yields on an average would be between 10 and 20% less as a result. In India, however, climate is usually talked about in relation not so much to temperatures as to rainfall. And on the rainfall side, things are not as clear-cut as they are on the temperature side. But even in the case of rainfall, from 2000 onwards, there's been hardly any year which has been above average. I think there have been just 3 years in the last 8. every other year has been below 100. Okay, they are not necessarily that they are below normal in the sense of being below 6% of normal, or they are not, drought years as defined as less than 10% nationally and less than 20% for any particular state. It's not that sort of thing. But the sheer persistence that if you draw a graph, there are very few points at which it goes above 100, is telling you that there is something happening there as well. Now, the reason I've just put these together is that these are really important problems. And for agriculture, they are more important than for most other sectors. Nonetheless, you've got growth rates coming into even the most recent period, which is characterized by prices, as not horrible. Things become even more surprising because if you look at factor productivity evidence, and I'm talking about factor productivity evidence from several sources. The ones which give fairly recent ones and give long time series and comparable across countries is IFPRI and the USDA. Both actually show, interestingly, that while these climate variables have been going down or becoming worse since the 2000s, total factor productivity growth has actually been going up. So there is something happening, but the factor productivity data, let me tell you, stop in 2015, the ones that I'm quoting, these IFPRI. So we can't say too much about UPA NDS. But something is happening. Either because people are adapting fairly well, or government is doing the adapting, or helping people to adapt, whatever it is, that there is a positive outcome when it comes to the factor productivity side of the story. Now that takes me to the second part of finishing off the now, and that is coming closer to the macroeconomic, but not quite what I want to talk about as macroeconomic, and that is that government policy, since I did mention that, seems to have changed massively in the last 3 or 4 years. The best example is if you look at last year's budget. Last year's budget started off this, what is known as the PM Kisan. Now, as a result, which is basically a cash handout to farmers. Now, as a result, this added to a budget of 40,000 crores in the previous year of the ministry and 70,000 crores on top of that. Okay, but if you just look at that same ministry, go back to 2014, what had been added to it? It was an insurance program, which was the, what is it called? The Fasal Bima Yojana. And as a sleight of hand, that is, essentially agricultural credit was brought from the banking side onto the agriculture ministry. Now, all three of these, PM Kisan, which is the big one which happened last budget, but as well as insurance, as well as subvention, credit subvention, are really cash transfer. They have nothing to do with agriculture as such. They have to do with financing either people or institutions. The agricultural part of the programs of the Ministry of Agriculture were in nominal terms just about or even slightly less last year's budget than they were in 2014. You had a massive increase in the expenditure, but not in the expenditure that you would normally associate with an agriculture ministry, which is this crop, that crop, this particular program, either for sustainability or for growth. Now, underlying a lot of this, of course, is that the focus of the government, and this actually predates. In fact, when I was in the Planning Commission, we ourselves were, if you look at the 12th plan, it actually talks about farmers' welfare as something we have to shift towards, rather than simply looking at the tonnage of agricultural produce we produce. That was something which had been building up, but the present government, and in fact, I think it was the second Independence Day speech of Mr. Modi, who basically announced, or it may have been 2016, who announced that his main objective in agriculture is to double farmers' incomes, rather than either agricultural sustainability or agricultural growth. And both of those were not, neither of those were the operative things. It was doubling farmers' incomes. Now, many of us, of course, laughed about it, because doubling farmers' incomes in the span which was talked about meant something like a 15% growth per annum, which has never been achieved, certainly in India, but for a sustained period of time anywhere else in the world. And but nonetheless, that somehow you make money available to farmers is the issue, rather than agriculture for agriculture's sake. Okay, that is, to make agriculture better. Now, if you look at that in the context, then these changes in the budget are not too surprising. It is essentially subsidizing agricultural credit, massively subsidizing insurance, and with PM Kisan, you are actually making strict cash transfers. Now, is it then that we are moving away from completely the focus on agriculture? Not that the government can answer. They would say certainly not. But it's fairly clear that if you are sitting in a ministry and certain sections of that ministry are spending 10 times the amount you are, most officers would like to go to that part of the ministry rather than stay in those parts of the ministry which are not growing. So talent would actually move in certain directions. But it also tells us that in terms of macroeconomy, for those who matter are old issues. Why was agriculture so important in India in the past? The main reason was that you needed to feed people. And Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan was essentially a thing about farmers have to be praised because they feed the rest of us. And it's the fact that we are food short, or we can become food short, and that the farmers are producing the food and they have to be respected and helped so that we don't run short, was the prime mover of the agriculture policies. Now, obviously, there was, as with any sort of a big, broad direction, there are certain limitations to that. The main limitation was, not when it started, but over time it became a limitation, is that we got very, very limited to cereal crops. There was a time when cereals still make up 60% of the calories that we have. Okay? But there was a time when it made up about 60% of the amount of money a very large number of people spend on food. And we were a cereal short economy in terms of calculations regarding what does the average person need in terms of cereals and how much are we producing. We were always, tottering below in some sense. But somewhere in the late 80s, we had actually crossed that minimum norm of consumption. We were producing a lot above that. And after the during the 80s, we started emerging as a major cereal exporter. So we were not short of cereals. In fact, at the moment, we are exporting about 14 million tons. We are stocking up in most years. And nonetheless, a lot of our policies became, we have to go from 150 million tons to 200 million tons, 250 million tons of what? Of food grains. And we neglected the fact that there is other food and that agriculture is about all of them as well. Now, cereals, of course, also have another reason why it's so much in the minds of certain politicians who even now say, the agriculture minister always in their things will tell you, this year our production has been 260 million tons of food. It is because the great iconic revolution in India was to do with cereals, and that was the Green Revolution. It's odd that we still see our past as up to 1964 or 66 or 67, pre-Green Revolution days, which are not so good. Then you have the Green Revolution, which actually starts increasing yields. And after that, we've been waiting for a very long time for a second Green Revolution. Okay, so somehow there's this idea that technology comes in big leaps, and there was no leap like the Green Revolution. And Green Revolution was really only fascinating. Now that's the past that I would enter. And in that past, what drove it? Yes, it was to some extent the fact that there was malnutrition. People spent a lot of their money on food, they were poor, and much of what they spent on food was on cereals. And addressing that problem was clearly the number one problem in the 50s or the 60s. But during the first 30 years or so of Indian independence, there was another problem which went with agriculture, and that is more or less the overall rate of growth of the entire economy dependent on the rate of growth of agriculture. Now, for the beginning, this was direct, and it was just agriculture made up about 50% of your GDP. There, obviously, it makes. But even as agriculture share in GDP started coming down, the following made for it being a very, very large player in overall GDP growth. And that following was that if agricultural output didn't keep pace with consumption demand, you got inflation. And inflation always meant that you cut back on public expenditure. And in our first 30 years, public expenditure was the driving force behind almost all investment. As a result, any slowdown in agricultural growth forced a slowdown in overall growth. Now, some of these equations have changed. And today, for example, it's not the case. With about only 15% of GDP coming from agriculture, the direct linkage is very, very small. But the indirect linkage is also relatively small because of a number of reasons. First, food is much less important in people's budgets than they used to be earlier. But it's still the case that the food share in total consumption is not negligible. It's, for many people, it's still the dominant, and for the country as a whole, is about 30 to 40%. But cereal share is very small. It's now about 10 to 15%. Other food has increased. So the inflationary impact, it does happen. It is still the case that the government is sensitive to food inflation. But it is really not as important for policy as it used to be earlier. It's partly because there is a lot of other inflation except food as well. But most importantly, the one thing which has happened, and this is something which happened in late 1990s, early 2000s, it is that we are in absolutely more or less open economy as far as even agriculture is concerned. I mean, with the WTO, we opened up all our sectors, but then agriculture was also opened up. Of course, agriculture is still closed relative to other sectors, but agriculture also opened up by 2001. Now, in an open economy, of course, what happens is that price influences are not necessarily due to domestic supply. Those come from abroad. So you can have food inflation with your output pretty high, simply because there is food inflation elsewhere. So that food inflation itself does not today necessarily mean that government spends on agriculture. And you can have situations where output is short, but there is no food inflation because world prices are low and you can simply import. So, changes in trade policy and the fact that the share of food has been declining has meant that the policy perspective on the importance of agriculture in the overall economy has also grown less. all of this, there is another big thing which matters. If you look at the importance of food for the national economy, then to take a very, very simple model, it's not the model which works, but suppose that agricultural growth is, let's say, 2% per annum. And suppose population growth rate is, say, 2% per annum. Okay? Then you have 0% rate of growth of per capita food consumption. If you're a closed economy, and if you think that any shortage will lead to inflation that you don't want, then unfortunately the only equilibrium then is a 0% growth of per capita overall incomes. Okay? Now our agricultural growth was about 2.8, 2.9. But for a long time, it was our population growth was 2. In the mid-70s, became 2.4. And during those worst phases for food crisis, our population was not only growing fast, higher than 2%, the rate of growth was increasing. Today, our population rate of growth is roughly 1.2, 1.3%. So for that 2% itself, growth itself, your per capita income can grow, per capita food availability could grow at about 0.7. And if food has a income elasticity of say 0.3 or something, you can easily have an overall growth rate well over 4%. Okay, and of course for agriculture. So this relationship between agricultural growth and overall growth, and I keep saying this because my PhD thesis was entirely on that subject, is a bit of a thing of the past. Okay? But that is also interesting, which I think, in terms of what has happened to policy, coming back to the present and to this issue of crisis. See, there can be two things which hurt agriculture rather than the overall economy. One is, we're thinking of a situation not so much of perpetual shortages, but of an economy which is open to world trade, which has shocks coming from international side, and it also has shocks in terms of the weather. Then there is the whole issue of how are these shocks transmitted to the farmers. Now, amongst the shocks which are transmitted to farmers is the following. In a closed economy, in a completely closed economy, you have a situation where the main shock of the farmer is weather shocks, because there are no international shocks. Weather shocks mean less output. Less output means shortages, higher price. Governments feel threatened, they cut back on output, whole GDP depends. But in a closed economy, a bad year is a year which is not so bad because it usually comes along with a price rise. So you lose something on the output side, you gain something on the price side. In an open economy, that doesn't happen. You can have a bad agricultural year and world prices are low, so you can have a double whammy. Of course, you can have a double slam as well. If your output is very high and the world prices. But whatever it happens, the fluctuations are much larger. And this is precisely what has happened over the period and particularly after the liberalization and continuous liberalization. And in any case, of course, as was pointed out, and I haven't actually focused on this, India is too large a country for there to be similar things in all parts. We cover all sorts of temperature, we cover all sorts of crops, we've got farmers specialized in all sorts of things. So these shocks can take all sorts of forms and can create localized crises at a much larger level than a generalized crisis. And in some sense, that is happening. And that's being aided by the fact that over time, we didn't, and we couldn't, for some reason, get away from our obsession with cereals and didn't quite build up for the fact that agricultural production is going to be much more diversified. It would need much more markets because with food, what we did, we borrowed straight from the Americans. We had a price support system and then we put in our own type of price support, which is MSP. We didn't have a private sector which we could rely on like the Americans did. So we had our MSP, we had government purchases, worked well in certain areas, but only in certain areas and only for rice and wheat. As agriculture started diversifying, this didn't work that well. But nonetheless, again, there are some good points to be said. What are these good points? Well, the first of them is the following. And this is related to something I have not said, but let me first say that and then I'll come back to this. Which is that for most of the time, in terms of the drivers of growth, we saw irrigation to be the most important driver. Yes, there was technology. Green Revolution was this big technical leap, but we thought about technology as coming in big leaps. We didn't see it as coming in small doses. And Green Revolution only came to the irrigation part, which is why irrigation was seen as so important. And before the Green Revolution, irrigation was the driver. Well, irrigation has become much less of the driver of our agriculture. And to the extent it still remains, it is entirely groundwater. And it is groundwater which is in many places simply running out. And in any case, it's becoming more expensive to grow. So it still remains a very important, without water you can't have any agriculture. And that water is getting much more expensive. So you don't have it as a driver so much as something which is necessary to keep your agriculture growing. If you are looking for what is driving agricultural growth, it's not more water. And water was supposed not only to drive growth, water was also supposed to be the thing which actually which reduced fluctuations and which was important in terms of preventing shocks. Loss of water was the main shock. But the funny thing about the Indian situation is this, that just as you can take an average of growth rates to see what's happening, say 5-year average, 10-year average, and see what's happening over time, you can take the standard deviation of those growth rates to see what is happening to fluctuations over time. During the 2000s, the average of growth rates goes up, but, and even more surprising, the standard deviation of growth rates comes down. And comes down quite substantially. So again, something is going right somewhere. But in this case, we can pinpoint where it is. Much of this is coming from diversification. That is, you are not dependent on one or two crops. There are a large number of crops, and the movements going either way cancel it out. There are other reasons. I think people, for example, when we say irrigation isn't working, this, that. Minor irrigation, just farm ponds, watershed development, all of those things which are not sexy in the eyes of a lot of old-fashioned irrigation walas, do seem to be paying off. But by and large, the reason for the decline in the standard deviations is diversification. And that diversification is to horticulture, it is to animals. And in addition to that, of course, is that after some time, after a long time, technology has also started moving into those other areas, into those other crops. So we are in an economy where a great deal of diversification is taking place. We don't have the markets to cope with that diversification. And we have the added difficulties of an open trade and a policy on the trade side, which at best is knee-jerk reaction. And I think amongst the knee-jerk reactions is handouts to farmers. Because there may be a case for cash transfers, universal basic incomes. But there's none at all for universal basic income only for farmers. They are not the poorest. The poorest are the farm labour. And you cut them off, you have a universal unadjusted transfer to all the farmers. You are being selective, but you are also being stupid. Because a lot of people are going to actually sign up for whatever is necessary to become qualified as a farmer who can get the money. At the moment, it's any piece of land. So you're likely to see, for example, people buying land. Or people not moving out of land when they've got something. So you can have bad policies not simply because you're not doing the right thing by agriculture, but because you think you're doing the right thing by something else and not doing the right thing. I think I'll stop there.